Well, as we've already mentioned, and hopefully you have observed by this point, we are beginning a new series called The Art of Neighboring, and it is based on, as Pastor Tim mentioned, a book called The Art of Neighboring. Though it's rooted in the Scriptures, we're being guided by that book. And as he mentioned, the books are for sale, and there's material in them that we're not going to talk about. So if you're really interested and want to learn more, I encourage you to buy one of those. So, and again, we're looking at what the second half of Jesus' great commandment. He says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. I think that's actually the purpose that we are placed on this earth to do, is to both to love God and love our neighbor. And so in this series, what we're doing is we're saying, as I said last week, when Jesus said neighbor, maybe he meant, wait for it, your neighbor. And so we're going to try and take that, actually interpret that literally, and spend some time getting to know our actual neighbors. That's the goal. And when we first started this, started talking about doing this, I was very excited about this because as Pastor Tim mentioned, I actually see this not as hopefully just a series, but as kind of a new initiative for our church. Because if this is a concept that if we get these principles and we could get them down into our soul and kind of into the DNA of our church, that this is how folks from Hanfield, this is how Hanfieldites live in their community. They live as good neighbors. Then I actually think, as Pastor Tim mentioned, that it could be something that begins to bring about the revival for which we've been praying and for which we've been seeking God. So I've been very excited about it. But on the other hand, it's actually very challenging and convicting. So this is not the first time that I've read this book or looked at this material. It's I read it a couple of years ago, and so then when Jen and I, when we lived in Richmond, we were terrible neighbors. We didn't really get to know our neighbors all that well. I mean, we weren't like, our dog wasn't barking at night, and we weren't that kind of terrible neighbors, but we just didn't get to know them. And so when we moved to Marion, we thought, you know what? We're going to start over, and we're going to we were going to go for it. We're going to get to know our neighbors. We bought bananas and let them rot, and so we're going to make banana bread, right? And then what happened is they just continued to rot, and we never made the banana bread. We're going to distribute to the neighbors. We're going to have a welcome ourselves to the neighborhood party, invite everybody over. And would you like to know how much of that we did? I mean, like everybody else, we start to do this, and we want to have these ideas, and then we get busy, and it just never happens. I'll do it next week, and I'll do it next week, and do it next week. So this material for me is convicting. So as I'm here preaching to you, I just want to be honest with you. This is not something that, it's not as though I have already attained it, so to speak. So hopefully you will be as challenged as I am by this topic. So our passage this morning, I think, is helpful for us. It comes to us from the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of the most famous passages in the Bible. If you want to turn there, Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. The Sermon on the Mount, interestingly, I've heard it referred to as a disciple's handbook. And that's because if say all you had of the Scriptures was the Sermon on the Mount, you could do a pretty good job of living the Christian life. I mean, that's pretty good description. You could if that was all you had, you could do a pretty good job of living the Christian faith. And so I think this passage this morning provides us maybe with some background and some insight into why we would want to practice this kind of neighboring thing in the first place. So if you look with me in Matthew chapter 5, in verse 13, Jesus says this. He says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Now, if you notice there in that first verse, Jesus uses some pretty strong language. He says that when he's talking about this tasteless salt, he says that it's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to be that useless salt. Amen? That doesn't sound like. So whatever Jesus is saying here is probably pretty important. We need to understand it and begin to put it into practice. And he uses a couple very rich analogies. I think there are really two aspects that I think Jesus reveals to us in these analogies about what it means to fulfill the calling that exists in our lives as a result of being followers of Christ, particularly as we think about being good neighbors and engaging with our neighbors and the rest of the world. And the first of these, again, as I see, is instructions, verse 13, beginning there is a call to live in a way that is different or distinct from the world around us. In both of these analogies, there's a sense in which Jesus is calling his disciples to be separate, to be distinct and different from the rest of the world. And we see this in verse 13 with this analogy with the salt. Think about this. In order for salt to influence something, you've got to add it to something that is other than salt, right? Does that make sense? If you add salt to salt, it doesn't change anything. So it's a call, I think, to be different than the world around us. So in verse 14, when he says, "You are the light of the world, a city on a hill cannot be hidden." A city on a hill is distinguishable from the land around it. I have a good picture of this because in between college and seminary, I had the opportunity to go study in Israel, and I worked at for a couple weeks. Worked on an archaeological dig. We worked at Tel Rehov, which I was told before we got there was a rich archaeological site, but it was not rich in things that count, like shade and water. It was like 110. Archaeology, it's actually miserable. Never mind. I'm glad somebody does it. Okay. If you've seen Indiana Jones, it's nothing like that. Okay. Anyway, but so we're there at Tel Rehov, and it's basically the whole terrain is just this. It's just big flat dirt, for miles and miles. Kind of picture Indiana-like terrain, very flat, and then there's one hill, and that was it. So when Jesus talks about a city on a hill, that's kind of the image that he has in mind. It's just flat, 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 one little hill. And so if you build a city there, it can't be hidden, and that's what Jesus is talking about. In verses 15 and 16, he continues on with this analogy of light and telling his disciples that they're to let their light shine before others. Well, think about this with me. Light, by its very nature, is different than darkness, right? Light and dark cannot occupy the same space. So they're necessarily separate, necessarily different. So I think there's a sense in which Jesus is calling his disciples, and by extension us, to be distinct, to be different than the world around us. As a result of being made a new creation, he's calling them to be different than the world around them. This is exactly what, for those of you who were here during Lent, this is exactly what we talked about in our Thriving in Babylon series. Part of it was a call to be different than the world around us. And I think this actually becomes more clear when you read the passage that comes immediately before this. In verse 3, the passage that comes immediately before this is what's commonly referred to as the Beatitudes. Right, you've heard of this, I'm sure. Beatitudes. In verse 3, Jesus starts this sermon with a series of actions that receive blessing and then the consequences. And he mentions these several things that are blessed. He said, Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers, and so on and so on. And each one of these, he says that those who practice these things, their reward will be great in heaven. And so in essence, I think what these things signify in the Beatitudes is this is how someone would live with those attitudes in their minds and heart if they lived with Christ at the center of their lives. That's how you would live. I think it's a call to be a holy people. Right? That's what the word holy means, actually. You may know that. Holy means it means to be consecrated or to be set aside for special purposes. And that's what Jesus is calling them to. And I think living with these attitudes in mind would make someone very distinct from the rest of the world. These Beatitudes that when Jesus mentioned, they were quite countercultural. And in fact, in 2019, I think that they are still very countercultural. Because perhaps even more so. Because heavenly priorities are not something that we often see lived out in the world around us. In fact, hang on to your seats. I think even sometimes we as Christians don't necessarily live with those kind of priorities. I think sometimes we as Christians are not really all that different from the world around us, right? If we look at the statistics about divorce, about the use of pornography in the church, if we think about the movies we watch, all of the way we use our time, the way we use our finances. Do we participate in sports on Sunday, or do we come to church on Sunday? Are we allowing our priorities to be set by the world around us, or are we allowing the gospel and our relationship with Jesus Christ and worship to take priority in those things? So I think we're called to be distinct. We're called to be a peculiar people. We're called to be different. Because if we're not, then we don't really have anything to offer the world around us. If we just seek to blend in, we have nothing to offer them. So that, I think, is the first call that Jesus gives his disciples, is to live differently. And if we lived with verses 3 through 12 in mind and really embodied those Beatitudes, I encourage you to read those sometime this week, then I think we would naturally live differently. We would naturally be a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. So, with all of this talk of difference and separateness and distinctness, and you might say, well, I thought this was a series on, learning to get to know our neighbors. I thought that's what we were doing here. So what about what's going on here? Well, I think this is actually the second calling that we see Jesus give his disciples, is that although he calls them to be distinct and to be different, he actually calls, the second aspect is that he calls his disciples and us to be about the business of sharing the gospel with those around him. In verse 13, he again, returning this analogy of the salt, he uses this analogy. He says, you are the salt of the earth. And now in our contemporary world, we think of salt as something that's like unhealthy and you try and avoid it. Or Pastor Jeff and I were talking about, this week that I guess the term salty is like, it's a bad phrase. Like, someone is salty, that's a bad thing. Okay, you don't want to be salty. But in this context, I think we do. But from a first century perspective, salt was not just like something that they put on their French fries. Okay, though they would have if they had had French fries. I'm sure of that. But it was used for taste. It was used for taste, but it was actually more than that. It was something that was used to preserve food, right? It prevented decay and prevented rot. Now, I think there's a whole sermon right there, friends, about we're to be the salt of the earth. We're here to prevent decay, prevent rot in the world. Amen? But I'm going to leave that alone and move on because that's not in my notes. As some of us suggested, we have a lot of medical folk here. Some of you might appreciate this. Some of it was used as an antiseptic, apparently, back in the day. Early form of antiseptic. Just seems like that would hurt, but there we go. Now, what use Jesus is referring to here, it's not actually the point. But the point is that it was something that it was very useful to humans. It was necessary for life. It was necessary for life. And in fact, I think the biggest thing is here that salt changes whatever it interacts with. Or it changes the flavor of whatever. You add it to food, you can't not tell that salt is there. If you add salt to your food, you know it's there. So it changes what it interacts with. And I think in other words, I think the analogy that Jesus is using here is he's calling his disciples to be change agents in the world through sharing the good news of his coming and his death and his resurrection and his ascension to be with the Father. They're to be change agents in the world through sharing the good news of the gospel. And then he clarifies this further, I think, in a second analogy in verse 15, which I think sheds some light, we might say, on top of this, pun intended. Thank you for that laugh. First service, I cracked myself up. I think I was the only one that laughed at that, but I thought it was funny. He sheds some light on this to help us understand this a bit further. In verse 15, he says, "Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." I mean, this is something we've known since we were children, right? What was the song? Hide it under a bushel. What? I'm gonna let it shine. Yes, good. Okay, you all passed Vacation Bible School. That's good. Appreciate that. Very good. But so Jesus is saying, what he's saying here is that anyone who has received that gift of salvation and to not share that gift with others is as absurd as lighting a lamp to provide light for your house and hiding it under a basket. I mean, that's absurd. I said in the first service, not to mention dangerous, because if it were like a wicker basket, you'd burn your house down. So don't do that. But I want you to think about this with me. Not only is it super silly to light a lamp in order to provide light and then hide it under a basket, it's actually contrary to what the nature of what a lamp is for. I mean, a lamp, the nature of a lamp is to provide light for the world. And so it's the nature of a lamp is to shine light in the darkness, and for it not to do so is unnatural, right? And so what I want to suggest to you this morning is that Jesus is saying it's just as unnatural for us as Christians who have experienced the salvation of Jesus, who have been changed and transformed through by the power of the Holy Spirit, who've experienced that, to not share that with others is just as absurd. It's just as unnatural. And so if we've really experienced that salvation and we understand what it really means, then what we would do is naturally we would share that with other people. John Wesley said it this way, and I think we've talked about this before, and he might have even said this when he was here last fall, for those of you who are here, met John Wesley. He said that you have nothing to do but save souls. Therefore, spend and be spent in this work. You have nothing to do but save souls. Therefore, spend and be spent in this work. So we've actually got to be about the business of sharing Jesus with other people if we're not going to be like the lamp that has been lit and hid under a basket, or like the useless salt that isn't good for nothing but being trampled. So what does all this have to do with a series with the art of neighboring? Well, I think the same calling that Jesus gives his disciples persists for us today. To live to live differently in a Christ-centered way, such that other people, when our words are consistent with our lives, that people are drawn to us and ultimately to the witness of the gospel in our lives. And Jesus actually, this is what he gives us as a great way to do that. He says in verse 16 again, he says, "Let your light shine before others in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven." So it's through the living out of our lives and others seeing that witness of our lives that they're then drawn to glorify God. And that's what this series is about. And particularly, what we're talking about here is to learn to do that with our neighbors who have ample opportunity to observe our lives and see the witness of our lives and our actions and point them towards Christ, especially if we are intentional about getting to know them and getting to know who they are. And so that's our goal. You see, that's why we're pursuing this series, because it's one thing for us to say, kind of crack the whip and say, come on, get out there, share Jesus. And so but in this series, what we're doing is we're trying to actually give us the tools and the resources to means to do that. And so actually, we should have a video here. I want to just show a quick video. It's by the authors of the book that we're using to guide our series, and it gives a little more insight into where we're headed over the next 6 weeks. That's pretty convicting, isn't it? When they're citing city officials who are encouraging them to follow the words of Jesus. It's a convicting thing. In a moment, Ronald's going to come and lead us in a closing song. And after that, on the way out, you're going to be handed one of these. The usher should have a little neighborhood map. And you might say, "Oh, that doesn't look like my neighborhood." But it is. This is your neighborhood. And you saw this portrayed in the video and on the cover of your bulletin as well. And what it is, this is the goal over the next several weeks, is that you see, if this is your house, can you name all of the neighbors that live around you? Could you just know their names? And it'd be more impactful if I remembered the statistics, but it was something like 70% of people or something can't name all of those neighbors. So can you name all those neighbors? And then if you know them, If you know their names, do you know something about them that you cannot observe simply by looking out the window, right? You can observe a lot by looking out the window. My wife does this very well. You can observe a lot about your neighbors by looking out the window at them. But do you know something beyond that? And then at a deeper level, do you know something about them that is at their what's their deepest heart? What's their deepest passion in life? What is God calling them to do? What's their deepest burden that they may have? Do you know them at that level? And so that's the challenge over the next several weeks, is to just take this one. You take this home, put it on your refrigerator. We're going to continue to talk about it in the weeks to come. Take this home, put it on your refrigerator, and begin to write down. Do I know their names? Do I know something about them? What do I know? And I would advise you that if you have them over for dinner or something like that, you should probably take it off the fridge, because that would be a little bit creepy. You're like, the Braggs. Okay, I saw that they. You just start writing. That's probably not what you want to do. But that's our aim. That's where we're headed. Our goal in this whole series is simply to give us the tools that we need in order to begin fulfilling what Jesus calls us to here, which is to be the salt and a light, to share the good news of Jesus Christ with our neighbors. That's our goal. So our goal is that somewhere along the way, somebody would say, I don't want what the culture offers me. I want what Jesus Christ offers me. And I've seen it in him. I've seen it in her. I want what he has. I want what she has. I want to know the God that they know. And ultimately, as Jesus says here, that's our goal, that they would look at us and be drawn not to us, but ultimately to the God that we serve.